Today on the Women Mind the Water Artivist series on womenmindthewater.com, I'm speaking with Wallace J Nichols, an advocate for everything water, ranging from wellness and wildlife to the environment. Jay is the chief evangelist for water in the Blue Mind movement. Among other things, he is recognized for his scientific work with sea turtles, his best-selling book, Blue Mind, The Surprising Science That Shows How Being Near, in, on, and underwater can make you happier, healthier, more connected, and better at what you do. And he's co-founder of the Plastic Pollution Coalition. The Women Mind the Water Artivist Series podcast on womenmindthewater.com engages artists in conversation about their work and explores their connection with the ocean. Through their stories, Women Mind the Water hopes to inspire and encourage action to protect the ocean and her creatures. I am speaking with Wallace J Nichols, an authority on many things related to water. He has an extensive list of academic, environmental, and author credentials, and he is recognized for having coined the term Blue Mind. His untiring spirit has been featured in magazines as diverse as Time, Animal Planet, Vogue, and Surfer. He once took a 112-day hike from Oregon to Mexico with his partner and their 4-month-old daughter. And more recently, he experienced the effects of a massive wildfire on his property in the hills of Central California. Testament to his indomitable spirit, he has completed the 700th episode of his Blue Mind online book club. Now he is honoring us by being on the Women Mind the Water Artivist series podcast. Welcome, Jay. I am extremely pleased to have you here. Every one of my guests is amazingly talented and passionate about water, but I don't think any wield as broad a brush or with quite as much energy as you do. What is the origin story about what launched you into the big blue?
Well, it's an honor to be included on your podcast, and this has been a long time coming, and I'm really looking forward to our chat. I think, I'm like a lot of people. I can go way back to my childhood and think of those watery days where you just, it was the first one in and the last one out of whatever the body of water was. I just wanted to be in there doing whatever, whether it was a lake or a river, an ocean or a pool or a kiddie pool even, or my bathtub if it was bad winter weather. And that's really, I can think back and that's really what it was. It was a deep love of the feeling. And life on land was fine, but it was complicated. And I stuttered. I was an introvert. They called us shy back then. I was adopted, so I had big questions about my life and life in general and things like genetics. But in the water, I just felt at home.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you said you're a marine biologist, and you didn't start out that way. You went to North Carolina where you majored in economics and policy. So how did you imagine that the study of economics was going to affect your future?
Yeah, I wanted to be a problem solver. And so I studied, as an undergraduate, I studied biology and Spanish. And then I got a master's degree in economics and policy. And then a PhD in wildlife ecology and evolutionary biology. Thinking if you put that all together, that's a pretty decent toolkit to be a problem solver, rather than just a problem describer or a problem spotter. We need those as well. And that's a lot of people in academia describe problems, but they don't necessarily roll up their sleeves and get into the, into the mud of things, so to speak. And so I wanted to be kind of both. And so I kind of went about assembling a problem solver toolkit. What I've learned and have remedied is that also the emotional piece is so important. The human dimension, they like to call it in academia.
So I was surprised to read that in 1991, you received a fellowship to study sea level rise. And I don't remember there being much awareness or interest back in the 90s about that topic. What do you remember thinking in the 1990s about sea level rise?
But I remember working on a report as part of it's called the Bradley Fellowship, that I was one of the fellows, and we worked on a sea level rise report for the state of North Carolina. And I remember when it came out, we thought, wow, this is going to just rock the world, or at least the state.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't. It made a little ripple, maybe, and there just wasn't a movement to take that work further. It was not the way it is now.
And I have to say, when I moved to Maine about 8 years ago, sea level rise didn't seem to be a problem. But in the past 3 years, the reality has really become evident here in Maine. A recent storm brought quite a lot of rain, wind, coastal flooding, and infrastructure damage. And now people are a lot more aware of it because some of the fishing piers have gone. And I wonder, do you think sea level rise has gotten progressively worse, or is it just that people are now paying attention?
That's a combination. I think several factors: the storms, the surge, the frequency and intensity, sea level rise itself, and then people paying attention and maybe not having as much of a stomach for the destruction, as maybe they did in the past. And in North Carolina, people would get their houses clobbered on the Outer Banks, and then they get some insurance money and come back and rebuild in the same spot. And then, lo and behold, a few storms later, one would hit them right square between the eyes again, and they might have to rebuild again. And that just was part of the deal. I think insurance companies are sick of that. County planners, government folks and there's just less of an appetite for dealing with the destruction. So it's a combination of all of those things. Certainly a lot more awareness, and a giant mountain of science that back in the early 90s, we had some research, but now it's just exploded. We're almost, 35 years later, and the tools that we have to study the ocean and the coast are just so much more impressive. The satellites, all the technologies we have, the models, et cetera.
Right. Well, there's this conflict between the people who are more concerned about jobs and economics and those who focus on the environmental costs of sea level rise. So how do you balance the people who are more interested in if you do this, you're going to lose jobs versus, the environment is changing and we have to be more aware of the costs by doing X, Y, or Z for the economic reasons?
Turns out all of that destruction creates jobs. So the conversation has changed. It's not an environment versus jobs. It's what are we going to do together to persist, to be resilient, to take care of each other, to keep the things we care about and love somewhat intact. So, a hurricane comes through or wildfire comes through, the one thing it does is it creates jobs. So we have kind of this disaster economy, which is kind of weird.
That's a good way to describe it, a disaster economy.
Yeah. It's hard to move the buildings. It's hard to move the infrastructure. And so that's going to be a whole bunch of jobs taking down the rubble. And I saw it after the wildfires in California. It employed a whole bunch of people to do the cleanup and then to really rethink how and where we should rebuild. The issue is that we have lobbyists who are holding on tight to a certain kind of job, and they want to they're paid for by that industry to hang on to a certain kind of job. But those jobs will be replaced by a different kind of job. And some of those are going to be fixing what's broken, restoration jobs, clean technology jobs, clean energy jobs, and aquaculture or different kinds of food services that are more sustainable. So it's just a transition. So the tension usually comes not because of the loss of jobs to the environment, but a certain category of jobs that lobbyists who are paid to defend that industry usually have big budgets. They make a lot of noise and put up a lot of resistance.
So I'd like to talk to you about the Ocean Revolution, an organization that you co-founded. It's an international network, as I understand it, of Indigenous youth, ocean advocates, and scientists. How are the Indigenous youth and scientists connected at Ocean Revolution?
There's so many ways of knowing and so many ideas and so many young leaders around the world that their voices were not being heard. When we do ocean education, generally we were teaching young people how to be marine biologists and to learn about biology, maybe some oceanography. But we weren't really saying to young people, you can do anything for the ocean. You can be an ocean artist. You can be an ocean podcaster. You can be an ocean engineer or an ocean lawyer. You can be an ocean leader who doesn't really care to study biology. And we weren't hearing that. So we kind of set out to reach young people, and in particular Indigenous youth, with the message that we need, ocean everybody's, to get involved. Any job description you can think of, you can put the prefix ocean in front of it, and it actually makes sense. Getting out of the way appropriately and as quickly as possible, listening a lot, trying to provide the resources that the young leaders had identified that they needed. And at the time, that was, I guess, another one of those projects that was considered really far out. The message was, why are you working with Indigenous youth? Why are you working with youth? We don't have time to educate. I mean, it's too urgent. Turns out we do have time. There's urgency, of course, but these young people are now running the show, and it happens pretty quickly. They move from high school age to postgraduate to young adults, and they're in charge. And especially in Indigenous communities, that's true. Your Western visitors with a grant don't last long. People from the community stick around generally.
So what have you learned about Indigenous practices related to the ocean that might positively impact your work and the thinking of non-Indigenous scientists?
Well, I'll give you a really super fascinating example. We work with the Comcalc community. They're from outsiders call them the Seri Indians in northwestern Mexico. And they are a sea turtle culture. They believe that their ancestors are leatherback sea turtles, that they have a leatherback ceremony, that when they encounter a leatherback sea turtle, that they do sort of a 3-day singing, dancing, chanting ceremony that happens spontaneously. But when it comes to the black sea turtle, which is a kind of a variety of green sea turtle, they had a dozen different names for the different colors and different morphs of black sea turtle. And then when we did the genetics, we found a dozen haplotypes, genetic types that corresponded with their names of these different types, which is just, we said, hey, look at these results, pretty cool. You guys helped collect the samples. We did the lab work. And, their take on it was like, well, we told you that.
Right.
Why did you got these fancy tools and genetic science. But I love when, modern tools confirm and reiterate ancient wisdom.
I'm curious what you have found are the greatest concerns of the young ocean advocates that you have talked with and worked with.
Well, they seem to be concerned about everything a lot, and should be to some extent, whether it's climate anxiety, extinction anxiety, plastic pollution anxiety, the contaminants that are in the environment. We're finding them every time we look in a new place. My 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 biggest concern for them is the stress and anxiety that they're carrying. These young leaders who are so fired up and so committed. I know from experience that it takes a lot of energy to be empathetic all the time, and to have your heart connected to things that get destroyed. It hurts, and the pain is very, very real. I want to help them stay strong and stay creative and stay compassionate and not burn out. And I see very young people burning out, and mildly depressed about it, not knowing if it's worth it. That's heartbreaking, and that's not okay. It's not okay at all to have young advocates hit the wall, in their early 20s or younger. And so we need to do a much, much better job, not just screaming about the end of the world, but giving the people who we're relying on to solve the problems the tools to stay emotionally, mentally, socially, spiritually strong. And we're not really doing that. Make sure you jump in the water as much as you can and play. Find joy. Because if you don't, you will burn out. And then all that education and all that work and all that thinking and all that creativity goes right out the window. And that's maybe one of the things we adults can speak with experience from. I've been there, gone through some tough, sections of the last decade of my life, and nature's helped me, being connected and getting in the water, feeling awe and wonder and joy and peace and freedom in the water allows me to come back and do the work.
So Jay, I'm really thankful for you for being here. It's in our brief time, we've taught only the smallest bit of your extensive knowledge. And I will post any links that you recommend on your Artivist guest page on womenmindthewater.com. I'm personally grateful for all you do and hope we can collaborate more in the future. I'd like to remind listeners that I've been speaking with Wallace J Nichols, an advocate for everything water. He's well respected as a scientist and author and active member of a wide array of nonprofits. Jay is the latest guest of the Women Mind the Water Artivist Series podcast. The series can be viewed on womenmindthewater.com, Museum on Main Street, and YouTube. An audio-only version of this podcast is available on womenmindthewater.com, on iTunes, and Spotify. Women Mind the Water is grateful to Jane Rice for the use of her song, Women of Water. All rights for the Women Mind the Water name and logo belong to Pam Ferris-Olson. This is Pam Ferris-Olson.